would like to introduce Alex. Alexandra Popovic. Alex is the Innovation Program Manager at Philips. If there is somebody who knows as anybody else in the world around imaging and surgical robotics, is Alex. I would like to invite Tal. Tal is the founder of Corindus. I'm sure all of you know Corindus Robotics. It's the first endovascular robot that was sold to Siemens about a year and a half ago. And last but not least, Arvind, who comes from a very small company called Medtronic, to help us really understand the world of the instruments, but how does it fit into their view of robotic surgery? So thank you, three of you, for coming here and being here in person. So when we start, and Alex, I'll try to still be a gentleman and ladies first. Can each one of you give us a quick overview, since you come from an imaging company, mostly imaging company, that's your core capabilities. Tal comes from a company that started, well, his experience with capital equipment mostly. Then he moved into a company who's doing more of an AI. And Arvind, who comes from a company that their core is the instruments, but they're looking to expand into other areas. So each one of you can give you different views of the strategy, as much as you can, of how do you view at Philips, in your world, and in Medtronic, the world of robotics?
Sure, it's working, yes. So, when we look at what we strive for at Philips is, it's not only about imaging or monitoring, but it's really caring for patient. And it starts with preventive care, diagnosis, therapy, monitoring, and tracking of patients throughout the care path. And that's why maybe I didn't raise my hand enough today, because I think we'll have doctors care for the patients and the robots and automation taking away technical tasks. So on that part, I really agree with you. And this is where we are also going with many of our different devices. You can take our patient monitoring device and think, oh, this also could be a robot because it's doing some things autonomously as well. So when we come to therapy, we are thinking about systems, X-ray systems, ultrasound systems, image guidance systems, as well as devices, balloons, stents, catheters, and all of those things. So when we think about robotics, we think about how can robotics improve us, innovate the procedure. And that means not really what has been the history of robotics is where do we use this robot next? It's more how we actually bring the robot into the procedure versus how we bring procedures into the robots. And that goes very much along the lines of what you were talking about, ecosystem. There's a device, there's intelligence, there's workflow tools as well, there's some imaging, there's some other components that all come together to innovate the procedure, to make procedures more effective, to improve the outcomes, to improve the staff satisfaction, to make physicians happy. We know how much burnout has been a problem for a long time, and now during COVID, even worse. So to kind of get that procedure better, to be able to better care for patients, and also to have healthcare providers be happy. So that's how we see it. The robots should come into the procedure and integrate into that ecosystem versus what has been happening before is bringing procedures to the robots.
Thank you. Tal?
That's a tough question to start with, but I think first I'll go back to your first slide. What is a robot, right? Because you have imaging companies say the imaging system is a robot. You have devices. So I think the robot is a combination of all of that. I think today, like Alex mentioned, the robot still is an add-on to the procedure. And I hope that in the next couple of years will be the enabler, because right now people still see the robot as a nice to have, it added value, but it's hard to quantify that to the clinical benefit of the patient. However, when you add the data, when you add the procedure planning, when you add all the things that we're going to discuss and you shared, robotic will just be the enabler because physician cannot do it manually. Similar to the car, similar to the aviation industry. You mentioned the 1 millimeter. I remember we're asking physician, what is 1 centimeter, not 1 millimeter? And they say that. And today physicians need to look on an imaging, doing the strain of the procedure and make really life-saving decision, which is hard. So robotic will be the enabler of that. But I completely agree with that. You can only have one robot doing the procedure, but there's so much on top of pre and post that goes into the robot. So you can start thinking about medical device that can do post-therapy and give the information back so I can plan the next procedure better. So there's so much I get that Medtronic is working on and other companies are working on to really create that entire procedure that will be done robotically. the last thing I'll say from a startup perspective, which I've been most of my life, the challenge is you cannot disrupt the procedure too much. That's a hard thing because physicians are used to do what they're used to. The best analogy is if you remember the one thing that's called BlackBerry and iPhone, and everyone were afraid to switch. I will never be able to text while I drive, if that's allowed, or all that, and feel the keyboard. No one thinks about it right now. But to change that is you need to design a robotic procedure, which is hard because as a startup, you need to be really bold and have a lot of capital, which is also hard. And as a big company, you're afraid to disrupt your own business and cannibalize your current business. So consolidation will have to happen and some companies will have to work together, in my opinion.
Arvin?
Hello. Can everybody hear me? Oh. Yeah, for Medtronic, like you mentioned, we manufacture surgical instruments, advanced surgical instruments for minimal invasive surgery. And we see robotics as an enabler of minimally invasive surgery. That's the way we look at it. So it has the flavor of almost everything that was said here. We also believe robotics is here to stay. And people call out robotic surgery today. But I think going forward, nobody's going to call it robotic surgery. Surgery is going to be robotic. I think that's where the technology will go. And people will stop talking about robotic surgery because it's going to become quite prevalent going forward. But there are a lot of barriers today for that to happen, which we can obviously discuss later. I just wanted to make one comment on the autonomous robot. Yeah, I've looked into this because I have a need for it. There are hair transplantation robots that are completely autonomous. Just wanted to bring that.
Well, we can argue this, but let me leverage what you and Alex said. So Tal, I'm going to exclude you for 1 second. How do you manage the conflict that it's inherent in because you bought some instrument companies in the last couple of years, and that's your core, like guide wires, microcatheters. But one of the promises of Corindus Microbot is to reduce the amount of disposables you're going to use at a procedure. Because now, since it's not each physician, it's in his hands, we can customize a procedure, and all of a sudden you reduce, 10 catheters and guide wires to maybe 2 or 3 or 5. So how do you handle that inherent conflict that as a company, hey, listen, we want to sell more of the disposables. On the other end, the robots may be able to streamline this. Is there an inherent conflict, or how do you view that?
I don't believe there is a conflict, because if you think about what we need to do as industry and also as a company is create tools to care for the patient. And as I explained at the beginning, care for the patient in monitoring, send them home with the right sensors, and diagnose them in the right time. And that needs to be optimized, because that's what health systems are asking us to do. That's what, where the regulatory is going to go, where reimbursement is going to go. So our job, and that's where the biggest value capture is as well, is caring for the patients in the best way possible. So yes, maybe temporarily some people will feel pain of not selling more devices, but there's other places where you can create value. So I don't think that's a really very deep conflict. It's what really needs to happen, I think Tal said that, I'm not excluding Tal, is really getting to the right outcomes, because outcomes are what is valuable in healthcare systems. They just capture value differently.
Arvin?
Yeah, I don't think there's a conflict either. The surgical process is a very complex one. And I think the various surgical tasks, unless you can get a Swiss knife of surgery, every task requires specialized instruments. And so I don't think there's a conflict. I think it's just at the end of the day, robot is a delivery system. It's the instrument that is actually doing the work. And, depending upon the anatomy and the condition you're treating, the instruments are going to get more and more specialized, and that'll continue to happen.
So robotic surgery started 30, 40 years ago with Intuitive Surgical. It's a $120 billion company, but still adoption is very minimal. Why? Tal, in your opinion, what are the gaps or the obstacles that we're still facing to get robotic surgery to become the mainstream?
I think first it's access. right? You mentioned capital equipment. Not all hospital has them, although Intuitive did a phenomenal job of really launching a lot of systems. And secondly, I think I agree with what Arvind said. It has to be a procedure, not a robotic. So it's still the robotic room, and I go to dedicated procedures over there. It's not my go-to, besides several applications. And third is, today there's still a gap between the robot itself and the devices, and the planning for that. So I think it has to be much more simple. It has to be much more cost-effective. It still costs money. Intuitive Surgical. The hospital is making money on the marketing, but not on the procedure. And all the robotic companies are still, they don't have a reimbursement code. So that will help. And the tag price of $1 million for all these big bots, it's too expensive. So it has to be treated like a robotic procedure. Now, I think there's also a perception that's part of that. Both patients and physicians are still afraid to being replaced. And that will help, because I still want to get that cases that I can do better than robot. There's no, by the way, randomized trial, manual versus robotic, because the placebo effect will be so huge, and the physician will do the procedure very carefully. So I think perception is key as well. And the last thing I'll say is the learning curve and the entire robotic procedure in terms of who's doing that. So it's not just the physician. You need to train the staff, the nurse, the technician, the scheduling, all of that need to work cohesively. They're not there yet.
Alex?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Tal said, but I would like to add outcome and efficiency across the care of the patient. So I think what we have been as an industry successful to show is technical outcome of the procedure, but it has to go end to end. The patient has to be healthier, go home healthier, and be long-term healthy after a year, after 5 years. And that needs to improve for that to be accepted. And it's similar to any other medical device. So it really has to be improving the care of the patient and not only technical details of the procedure.
Arvind, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with the comments. You know, said differently, I think any robot that you take today, whether it's the 3 robots that you put up in your slide there, the more popular ones, there is no compelling value equation today. So what I mean is benefits minus cost, that is patient-centric. The hospitals benefit through marketing, and that has, drove penetration to 2, 3, 4% that you saw. In some procedures, there's advantage relative to open or manual, and that's happening. But till there is a compelling value equation and a value proposition that is patient-centric, which is outcomes related, I think it'll be difficult for robotics to take off. And then there are two parts to it, obviously. One is the cost. And technology is improving, so the costs are coming down. Competition is coming in, so there is a natural cost curve that everybody can take advantage of. But the outcomes need to follow. And I think both need to interact for the adoption to become 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% from the, 2, 3, 5% today. So I think that is the barrier, because once you have the value equation that is compelling, then you're going to get reimbursement. You're going to get everything else will fall in place. I think that is the big barrier.
Completely agree with you, but isn't that the perfect example of the chicken and the egg? So you start with an access. Not many people have access to it. And by the way, access is not just the capital equipment. Sometimes it's the skills, right, to do that. Second, you mentioned the fact that big data, like clinical data, to show that it adds value. And if we have this, that will lead to reimbursement. But isn't that the chicken and the egg? Meaning, if we cannot have access and more people using it, the more adoption, we can get to the data and the reimbursement. So does this beg the question, should we look into different business models? Arvind, in your opinion?
No, not only different business models. I want to go back to your ecosystem. Even though robots are being used in surgery today, I think there is still a medical device-centric approach. But I think, like you mentioned, there has to be a MedTech approach to it, where I think you have to overlay digital on top of robotics to make the learning curve better, the workflow better. I think that'll drive adoption as well, which is the ecosystem piece. And also, I think the value proposition should just not be surgeon-centric. If you take the example of the cars, right? We are today almost driving driverless cars. You can buy it for $200 a month on your Tesla app, if they're still selling it. But the journey started with GM almost 25 years ago. And I think the ecosystem is just not the technology or the solution, but it's the users. Originally GM promoted this because they were getting data to make the car more reliable and lower the warranty costs. Then they offered safety for the drivers, and then they let the parents track their patients, the children when they're driving, and then they shared information with the insurance companies, and then they took all the information from the cars and gave traffic, and so on and so forth. So I think the ecosystem is also all the users in the continuum of care. That's what makes it an ecosystem, and the value of whatever you're using increases with every usage. I think that's what differentiates, like you mentioned, an ecosystem from a technology or solution. And if the robotics companies can do more of that, I think that'll drive adoption, and it'll compensate for, some of the inherent difficulties in doing randomized controlled trials, for example.
Any other thoughts around this chicken and the egg approach?
Yeah, so I think, if we look, and I agree with Arvind, I think the value proposition was for surgeon now and for hospitals, but in a sense of marketing and attracting patients. But when you look where the health system is going, there are some key performance indicators that we need to impact with everything we build for the hospitals. And that's, for example, the length of stay, the readmission rates, the, staff satisfaction is becoming very important. So retention of staff is very important. So if you put all of that into equation, you can start thinking about business models where you're maybe even sharing risks with hospitals. So you're actually helping them get to the right key performance indicators for their practice or their hospital or their integrated delivery network, together with the robotics, with imaging, with monitoring, with all components of the ecosystem. And that's the provider, the insurance companies, the government in some geographies. So it's all of that together. So you can think about business models. You can think also about sharing that type of risk and helping people improve their indicators so that they are actually delivering care better to patients.
Any thoughts?
About the chicken or the egg?
Or the omelet?
Wow, we went all the way there. I think it's not necessarily clinical outcome. We all want clinical outcomes, but I do think like the car, right? We can show less accidents, but then driver makes mistakes and all that. So I think that you need to make robotics more accessible, easy to use, and part of the procedure. Meaning, I'll give kudos to one company that's not here, is Stryker. So they bought Mako. They actually put it down for 3 or 4 years and came back with a robotic procedure. So it's full procedure with device, end to end, and they really penetrate the market because they offering not just a robotic, they offer a full procedure. And I think when you do that, physician will get more along, and you need to bring them in. And Alex mentioned it's all about the patient at the end of the day. Today, we're still doing procedure based on what the physician wants to do, where he was trained, and the hospital guidelines, and sometimes FDA if they really care about. It's need to be based on that patient. I saw these last 10,000 cases. This is what I should do. This is a device I should use. And this is the planning, like a pilot. The pilot planned today, take off to landing, and then sit and drink coffee and observe that. That's the way I see robotics. But it's definitely the chicken, by the way, for the record.
So there's one variable that I never ask on a panel, but I'm going to ask today. In 10 years, there's going to be a shortage of 100,000 surgeons in the US. Do you think that fact will drive robotic surgery? Because somebody will need to replace them, right? Can we then move surgeries into more of the mid-level to do some procedures, not just the surgeons, physician assistant? Do you think that shift will help robotics or will hurt robotics?
I think it'll help. Robotics will help, and take the example of Philips bought VisiQ there is a severe shortage of intensivists for ICU care, and VISIC had a solution where one intensivist can take care of multiple patients, and I think the similar model can be replicated. Whether it is, and also as the robots become more autonomous, you're going to require less skilled surgeons, and you layer on top of that remote surgery, then you're going to get access to surgeons outside your country even. So I think the robotics will help in that regard.
I'll connect to that. I think the shortage of staff, whether it's surgeons or nurses or physician assistants, is going to really impact the whole health system. And then we need to bring out robotics and automation to improve that. So I absolutely think that's going to happen. And I see robotics impacting two ways. And what I like to say is superhuman powers. So giving really good physicians superhuman powers to do things that we were not imagining that were possible before, and giving training wheels to people who are less skilled to actually do more standardized procedures. And I think robotics will help on both fronts. So we will be opening the new types of procedures that are not imaginable today, more minimally invasive, more efficient, more effective, but also helping people who are not that skilled get to that level, which is basically what you call democratization of procedures.
Absolutely. And I can tell you from our experience with Exact, we have a couple of sites that the physician is no longer doing the procedure. It's a nurse practitioner that is doing the procedure. The physician gets like a quick email or a note into his iPad saying, just look at the trajectory, it can be anywhere, he approve it. And we can see the increase of efficiency in his site, which will definitely drive it. Tal, what are your thoughts? I mean, you guys designed Corindus mostly for the physician to stay away from the radiation. But do you think the next generations will help overcome that gap of shortage?
The short answer is yes. We started Corindus based on physician, but the goal was always remote and accuracy. That's the goal. The problem is always how do you prove that? But I think first you'll see a new skill set of robotic assistance, robotic tech, I took my son to the PCP, the physician never saw him, the nurse practitioner saw him, right? So you see skills that are elevated that you don't need to be that expert in those complex procedures and complex subset that you can do the majority. I think remote is a key part of that, and try to bridge. If you look on neurointervention, today you have a neurointervention cover 3 or 4 hospitals remotely, and basically being a robotic system. And if you go to a teaching hospital, you have fellows that are basically a non-skilled robotic system, right? That's what they do. The physician makes all the decision and let the fellow trial and error. But the challenge is how do you make it simple? And most robotics fail on that and the learning curve. And to me, it's just cost and make it simple. Whether it's disposable robotics, whether it's a handheld, whether it's even still capital equipment, I'm not against that. But you just need to make it simple so people can use that and benefit and plan for that. Because I think today, the learning curve for robotic is still harder than the learning curve of doing regular procedures. But also when you look on procedures, a regular physician is not doing a lot of cases. He's doing 30 or 40 procedures a year. That's not a lot when you think about how often do we drive our cars and how often do we do regular procedures. So robotic can augment that, but still need to be designed not to replace the physician, which is tough because that's a knee-jerk reaction. Why do you need the physician there? So you need to keep them in like Sully. You need him to land on the Hudson, right? You still need him.
So for the past 2 years, I was invited to come and present at the MDD, Boston, West Coast, and I walk around and I see mostly capital equipment and instruments. And our audience want to know, hopefully, what next? In 2 years, are we going to see different things? So we spoke about, obviously, the capital equipment, the instruments. We mentioned, big data analysis and imaging. So today you have mobile ultrasound coming to the market. So that can be, are there any other areas that you think will be part of that ecosystem? Mostly, I hear a lot about cybersecurity as we talk about smart devices. How about the mobile world? Instead of just Wi-Fi, I know the 5G is coming. Are there any other areas that will plug into this ecosystem that the audience, as they look, what next is going to be here, you think is going to be here?
So I think software and all connectivity is going to be very important. And what that means is, going back to caring for the patient, is that instead of having these episodic cares that only need episodic information, like you need imaging during the procedure, you will want to have connectivity into the history of the patient, the previous procedures, maybe not even in the same organ or in the same area. You have to actually pull all the data together and care for this patient over a longer period of time. And that actually includes interoperability between all these different software and hardware systems we have for caring of the patients. It will include what we call it Philips, and other companies call it differently, layer of engagement. So actually being able to pull that data at the right time, so not to overload physicians. Again, we talked about the burnout as well. So I think that data consolidation and the interoperability between different systems is going to be really, really important in coming years in order to be able to care for patients throughout their life and not only for episodic moments of care.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it briefly about personalization. 3D printing, for example. And so I think with all these technologies around, the implants, instruments, whatever you leave behind, or hernia meshes, anything, knee implants, a lot of these things can get personalized. So I think because no two patients are the same, so through software and 3D printing, I think it's possible now to do mass personalization. There was this model where if you personalize, it's going to get more expensive. But I think robotics and digital and all those things can give you the benefits of mass manufacturing, which is cost, at the same time personalized. I think that's going to be possible.
I agree with both. I want to take a little bit outside of the procedure. You mentioned data security. Security will be a big thing. And I think we start seeing that digitalization of the entire EMR and all of that, and that will feed into the procedures. Today, it's still separated. You can do a procedure in one site, you don't know what happened a year ago, 5 years ago, and the physician does not have the brain power to digest all of that information together. The risk with that is, one is data security, and second, with big data, there's a simple saying, garbage in, garbage out. So we need to make sure the data that we get is really good and high quality and annotated and validated. Otherwise, we'll do the wrong things of how do we treat our patients.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Any questions from the audience to our esteemed panel?
On your FDA submission, what was your definition of autonomous? I apologize if you've already covered this. What was the definition of autonomous?
You don't define autonomous. So you don't define autonomous, okay? The FDA number one concern is safety, okay? And then it's also about what's your path. Are you a 510K? If you're a de novo? So I can have like an hour discussion around it, and I'm still not going to tell you everything because it's confidential for the company. But pretty much the FDA looked into how this technology and what it's doing keep the patient safe and add value to the procedure eventually. I can tell you that we have some funny stories that we had some features that we had to take out in our first submission just to come back 6 months later and the FDA asking us, can you put it back in? Because as we go through the process, we understood that that part can benefit the patient. So there's no definition of autonomous. Sorry to disappoint you. Any other questions? Oh, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your fabulous presentation. You had mentioned enabling technologies that are underutilized. I'm just curious as to, all the people that are here. You mentioned AI and maybe some optics. What are those things that you're kind of, if you drill down those technologies, what would they be that would enable additional robots and and lead to the reimbursement that you're looking for?
I'll start. So there's let's say hardware and data technology. So there's sensing that is also underutilized. All the things that we have learned from the NASA or from airplane industry, dual systems that are actually one system is doing the autonomous task, the other system is observing the system doing autonomous task. So all sorts of safety technology that you can think being part of the robotics. Sensing, whether it's sensing of the tissue or sensing of what's happening, all of that is a technology that is right now underutilized. And then when you think about data and AI, the world is really big. It's decision support, it's being able to observe and quickly react faster as humans. All of those technologies right now quite underutilized. And when it comes to personalization as well, right now it's fairly standardized what robots do.
Since Alex started, I'll give you an example that is probably very relevant to Philips. There's an imaging modality called CT fluoroscopy. And if you go to most hospitals, you just stand there on the side as a coffee machine. Nobody's using it. And the number one reason it's because of radiation, not for the patient, for the physician. And they don't want to be there. But if you go and ask physician, do you want to use it? They said, absolutely. I just don't want to be in the room. Now we have robots that you take the physician outside the room. The CT fluoroscopy, which we hear all the time, I wish I could use it, for kids, for other procedures. Now we can utilize it. That's part of, for example, how we see day in and day out great technologies that we just don't use them for the benefit of the patient. Any more questions?
The United States Air Force actually dealt with a really similar problem in the invention of drone technology. With drone technology, they were competing with one of the most senior, respected, and competitive positions, the fighter pilot. And in a similar way, I think doctors are feeling threatened in their positions in sometimes. And what the US Air Force did, whether they intended to or not, has really in some ways bifurcated, where a high schooler with just 6 months of training, I don't believe an officer, can operate a drone and does so day to day. But then also there's still a fighter pilot track, a manually occupied vehicle and decision-making live. Do you think that it's possible that surgery is going to go the same way, that there will be a bifurcation of robotic surgery conducted by someone trained on robotic surgery, and then traditional surgery conducted by someone trained in traditional means, perhaps even dealing in entirely different in different specialties? Also, thank you very much.
So I can try to answer that. I don't think so personally. I think you have one procedure and you may have people that are more skilled that retain their manual skills for those very complex procedures that robotic is not designed to, because it's not worth to design robot for that 0.5% of the cases that you do that. But I think if you bifurcate, you lose the key component, which is the physician, right? They still need their decision making and all that. So I personally think you'll see physician less skills and more skills, like you see today, but robotic will enable to do more procedures. But I don't think it will bifurcate like drone personally and firefighter.
No, I agree. Today, if you see radiology, the radiologist felt threatened because the AI could pick up tumors, but now it's a complement, and to what it became a complement. So I think it'll be a similar model where, some of the mundane tasks, some of the safety tasks can be taken over by the robot, while the surgeon can do the most value-added activity. Today, they're just acting on every piece of information that's thrown at them. And so they can actually be more selective about where they actually spend their time and effort of the machine. So it's the combination of man and machine is going to be better than either of them alone.
So I will give you an example. 20 years ago, doing cholecystectomy was for the few laparoscopic surgeons. Today, to do an open cholecystectomy is malpractice. That's simple. So what we need to turn into a simple thing that in our industry known as a gold standard. We're not there yet. But once we get to that point, you will not have that options. However, you bring something if I can just twist a little bit your question, are we going to lose the manual skills of the physicians for the rare occasions that we do need them? Right? The pilots. We still need the guy, I forgot his name, who landed the plane on Soli. Soli, right? Without Soli, it will be a disaster. So the question I have always is, how do we look at the other way around? I believe robotic will be gold standard. How do we prepare for the rare occasions that we do need the human factor? And to be honest with you, I don't have an answer for that. And I think the person that will get an answer to that will be a very wealthy person. Now, for full disclosure, I don't want autonomous cars. I'm an old guy, still want my, I'm a James Bond guy. Wish I could have money one day to buy an Aston Martin, but that's a different story. Any other questions? Sorry.
Hi. My question is with regards to that collaboration you were talking about for that ecosystem to happen. So what do you see as preventing maybe this collaboration between the different companies and their technologies to be able to happen? One thing I'm thinking about is the data privacy, aspect, or potentially competitive advantage, of some of those companies. But I'm curious to hear, what. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's a chicken and egg problem, and the answer is a chicken. But there are a couple of things, right? There is one thing is in adoption, right? So, and that's why it's a chicken and egg. Until the adoption comes in, the people are not collaborating. And, I'm not going to make too many comments about laparoscopy. Maybe Arvind can say about that as well. But that's where the clash comes in, is that there's companies who are taking one path and companies taking another path. And sometimes that's in conflict. That's maybe the money and business model problem. But I think it's really the drive has to come from the health system, from the customers, because when customers ask us to collaborate, we have to do it, because then all these other things will disappear if we don't do it there. So I think it's really the drive from the health system to actually bring these things together and to improve the procedure and care for the patient. But there are a lot of limitations there. Opening the systems, there's some privacy, some security. Sharing of liability is also a big question. Once you put everything together, who is liable? So all of these things need to be ironed out to really bring this together. But there are examples outside of robotics when this is happening really well. So we can also take those recipes from patient monitoring, for instance, from other places where there's more collaboration and more of an ecosystem, even in a very highly critical health environments.
And it's even a bigger laundry list, IP. As you collaborate, who owns the IP? I have a couple of companies working on agreements right now with big companies, and that's the main issue, IP. It's a great question. And by the way, we speak about Philips collaborating with Exact, Medtronic collaborating with Philips, but how about the hospitals? How can we collaborate better with the hospitals? I always ask the hospitals, can we acquire patient data into our system, saying, no, it's ours. I said, no, you're wrong. The data belongs to the patient. It doesn't belong to you. But the hospital still think it belongs to them. So that, it's a much, much bigger discussion than private small companies or big corporate America can solve it, in my humble opinion. But that's a great question. I'm sorry, we're already 5 minutes and they're showing me kill it. Yes? We're good? Any more last question? Any more questions? They're giving me the yes? Okay, any more questions? If not, first of all, stay safe. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the panelists for joining us today. And I'd love to hear your opinion about how we're going to do better next year. Thank you.